with that, let me hand it over to Dr. Wildcat to give us some remarks here as we close out the banquet. So, if you could join me.
Mado, Sangeli, Fasan, Zoyaha, Yuchiha, Kadane Adene. How are you this evening? I've had a great 2 days here. Real compliments to, Jeff and Dennis and Jill and everyone who pulled this incredible conference together. Of course, as it usually is, I get invited to share something, but I'm going to take away a lot more than I'm afraid I'll contribute. But it's been marvelous to be here, and since I'm not naturally inclined to stand behind podiums, I'm going to move out from behind this stand here. I feel much comfortable when I'm moving. It's harder to hit a moving target, and I found that out earlier. So if you just keep moving, you can dodge things that people want to throw and everything. So here's what I'm going to do tonight. I'm going to address 3 themes in my presentation about indigenous perspectives on climate change, and I'm going to give an indigenous perspective, not the indigenous perspective. And the first rule of thumb to remember anytime anyone's going to talk about American Indian, Native American, First Nations perspectives, or I always use the plural, knowledges, is to remember that if anyone's ever gets up and presents themselves as an expert on Indians, please leave the room, because there is no such thing. There are over 560 federally recognized unique Native nations in the United States, including incorporated Alaska villages, and we have this incredible diversity, incredible cultural diversity. And so what I thought I'd do in sort of sharing an indigenous perspective is something that I always do, is tell stories. But I've done something I've never done before, and I thought it would be nice as I go through these stories to show you the faces of the people that I've had the pleasure to work with the past 30 years in Indian country because of my position at Haskell Indian Nations University. And I don't think there'd be any way I'd be giving a presentation like I'm going to give tonight but for that experience. Haskell Indian Nations University is the de facto international Native university in North America. Why do I say that? Because any member of a federally recognized tribe can attend Haskell or incorporated Alaska Village. And here's a demographic. I mean, think about this. On a slow year, we'll only have about 130 or 35 nations represented. Unique nations. From the Arctic shore to the tip of Florida. We'll have this incredible diversity. We have kids who come to Lawrence, Kansas from New York City and San Francisco, and they go like, why did my parents send me out in the sticks to go to school? We have kids who come in from Second Mesa in Arizona, or coming from Pine Ridge, or coming from Montana, and they get to Lawrence, Kansas, and they go like, man, this is a city. Urban, reservation, international students, because one of the things that American Indians are distinguished by is per capita we are the most active part of the American citizenry participating in the armed services. So a lot of our students have fathers and mothers who've had careers in the armed services, as they've lived in Japan, they've lived in Germany, they've lived in Italy, they've lived in England. So any stereotype you think about an American Indian working and living at Haskell Indian Nations University will disabuse you of that very quickly. And I can't think of a more important theme to talk about than this sort of intersection between the biological, ecological, if you will, the landscape, seascape diversity of the planet, and the cultural diversity that until very recently was a large part of that. So, what I'm going to do that I've never done is I've got some slides. Can we put the first slide up? I hope it'll come up. Do I need to hit a button or anything? Or? How many of you know Dr. Henrietta Mann? I see a few hands. Southern Cheyenne woman who grew up among the Northern Cheyenne. I'm going to try to make, I'd like to make 7 points. I don't have time. I want to leave time for questions, okay, tonight. So I'm going to get through as many of these points that I can, but so let me give you my disclaimer. Okay, here's my disclaimer. What I'm going to present tonight is a perspective that I don't think is uniquely mine, and it's not so idiosyncratic. And we've got a good number of Native people in here. They can call me out if they think I've misstated something or misrepresented something. In fact, I expect that because I'm going to speak tonight honestly as if I'm among relatives. I'm going to speak as family with you. That means I'm going to be honest, and as Merv Tano of the International Institute for Indigenous Resource Management will point out, that means, Dan, usually you're honestly wrong. And so that's fine with me. I'll come by it honestly if I misspeak. So I'm hoping we can have some really interesting questions and dialogue, and I hope I say something provocative that will challenge you and make you think differently about something. My perspective is the following, is that how do you take the incredible cultural diversity, the practices, the customs, the habits, the languages, and make generalizations? It's very difficult unless, after 30 years of working with many tribal people, you begin to see that there are certain principles that, although practiced, embedded in custom, ceremony, song, and language, that are vastly different, but the principles, shared principle, is there. And so I'm going to try to suggest to you that what Native people have to share is particularly valuable here today. Now, there's an apocryphal quote that's attributed to Einstein. I say apocryphal because I've tried to find the source for it. I mean, you can Google this on the internet. You'll find a dozen references to this quote. I cannot find where Einstein really said this, but everyone says Einstein said this. Someone wise said it. What did he say? Well, the story goes that he was working with a colleague on a very difficult physics problem, and the colleague couldn't solve it. And Einstein's remark, allegedly, was, you know, often you can't solve problems with the same kind of thinking that created them. I'm going to suggest to you that you can't hold the Lakota, the Seminole, the Arapaho, the Cherokee, the Passamaquoddy, the Dene responsible for the environmental crisis the planet faces today. Because their worldviews, their values, their principles of life are not the dominant ones that have shaped the institutions we move through today. So, let's try something different. I want to applaud and partner with scientists who are doing heavy lifting, but I want to remind the scientists, as we've heard repeatedly throughout this meeting, bear me out on this. The real hard work isn't the science work. The hard work's the cultural and social work. We need new ways and values of employing the tools you're using. You can't fix problems with the same kind of thinking that created them. I'm going to start tonight on these principles of sort of an indigenous perspective on climate change and indeed life with Dr. Henrietta Mann. I was dean, actually. I can't get away and say I was acting. I was dean for about 5 years at Haskell. One of the best things I did, I talked Henrietta Mann to come from the University of Montana to Haskell for one semester as a visiting faculty member. Okay? I'm going to be hitting up some Colorado State faculty too to come and teach at Haskell for a year. I think you'll find it quite interesting. My office was right next to her. And so when I really got bored with all that paperwork I had to do, which I was horrible at, I just listened to Henry. And one day she said something that I've quoted repeatedly and I'll continue to do because it's the first principle. She said, you know, in our tradition, she says, the idea of this question of spirituality is never one that we face when we come into the world in our families. Because in our worldviews, we know we were spiritual beings before we became human beings. And she said, in fact, the major problem we're facing on the planet today is per se not a spiritual crisis. The crisis is how, when we take this form, this human body, do we learn to be mature, competent human beings? I will argue the crisis we have is human immaturity. What's the marks of human immaturity? Oh, that's mine, you can't have it. Isn't that what our whole legal system's built on? Who owns it? Whose property is it? I have that, you can't have it. That's mine. We have economic systems, according to some models, that are based on self-interest and its extreme greed. Some people say, well, that's human nature. No, I don't believe it's human nature. The crisis is a cultural crisis because I can point to people all over the planet who did not have cultures of greed. I can point out people in this room who, in their own tribal traditions, when you are given a recognition and award, what is your requirement? You give away everything. It's not like, what am I going to get? No, I've been honored. What do? I'm going to give away all of the things that I've been given because I couldn't be who I am but for good relatives. Dr. Henrietta Mann made that statement. The struggle we have is to be competent human beings. We should frame the climate crisis we face on the planet today as a human competency issue and an issue of human maturity. With all the knowledge we have, what have we really learned? I think we've learned a lot. But the problem is we're moving through many institutions that are built on a set of values that aren't necessarily life-enhancing for the planet. We can't continue to treat the planet like an ATM machine, keep taking out and taking out and taking out, and expect that we're going to have a bright future. And that's the way we treat the world. Oscar Coagley, oh, what a dear man. Shannon, some of you in this room met Oscar, Yuchi Elder, one of the first people I met who really talked about intellectual traditions. In his case, Yupik intellectual traditions. Oh, aren't tribal people supposed to be savage and primitive and uncivilized? No. Well, Oscar, he wrote a whole book, Yupik Worldview, the Yupik Worldview and its relationship to modern science. And he said, I want to talk about our Yupik intellectual traditions. And Oscar reminded me of why the work that you're doing and why the presence, of Native people and the active participation of Native people is so critical, is because Well, the simple version would be as our friend Kalani Sousa says, you know, some minds are always better than one mind. Let's just face it. Some minds are always better than one mind. We need people with very different views looking at problems. And Oscar is the one who reminded me that part of the challenge we face today is, and in fact, Dennis and I were just talking about this, is that at a certain level, the cultural crisis we face is one where in a very changing world, as those environments, those natural landscapes and seascapes that made us who we were as unique human beings with specific cultures, okay? That with the changes, what do? How do you, as Henry Redcloud said today so eloquently, how do you use new ways to honor the old ways, okay? How do you use new ways to honor the old? He's talking about principles, see? What's the Lakota principle of life? He's not embarrassed to say it. He'll say it right to your face. Father, Son, Mother Earth. We live in that mix. This thin biosphere we inhabit on this planet depends on this kind of symbiotic interaction. Father, Son, Mother Earth. Our own lives are symbiotically, inextricably connected in a nature-culture nexus. So, what are some of the challenges we have? Some of the challenges we have is to reconnect how we're living to the places we call home. I don't think you should have a house in Fort Collins, Colorado that looks like a house someone's going to build in Boca Raton, Florida. I think it ought to look very different. We wanted to make a dramatic change in our carbon footprint. Let's get away from building the boxes that are just these strange attractors for carbon consumption, okay, that people just accept. That's because builders build these boxes, and we live in boxes. And then we always complain about people thinking in boxes. Why? If you spend all your time in a box, you're probably going to think in a box. Okay? We need to get reconnected in the world. We could build some incredible houses. We need to do a serious investigation of indigenous design and architecture. Okay? My people, the Zoyaha, the Yuchi, before we were removed from Georgia to eastern Oklahoma, lived in essentially 7 months, 8 months out of the year, essentially under arbors. Why? Have you ever been in Georgia any time between May and September? What you hope for before air conditioning is a breeze. So you're not going to build yourself a box and sit inside of it. You're going to have porches. You're going to have houses without walls. Why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we doing these radical explorations of things? I've got a word I use in Red Alert, and I call it indigenuity. Honoring the old ways with new ways are exercises of indigenuity. I'm not saying you should go back and live in a teepee. You can't. The bison were destroyed. By the way, not by the Indians. Okay? Contrary to Shepherd Kretsch. Okay? I've read Shepherd Kretsch's book, and he's got some good points in there, but I think he misses the big picture. And the big picture, the Plains Indians were acutely aware of how important that relationship with the bison to them was. That's why their most important ceremonies revolved around the relationship, the sacred relationship with the bison. Not an economic relationship, a sacred relationship. That's why all of us across the southern United States, from Southern California clear through, the South Atlantic coast, why many of our ceremonies revolve around corn. We had a very sacred relationship with corn. It was, in a real fundamental sense, the life giver to our people. I think the challenges we face today, and what I'll share with Oscar, when we get past all of the employing all the analytic tools we have, and I'm glad we have them, when we put the local sensors together with the remote sensors, that's what we really need to start doing. Let's get the local sensors together with the remote sensors, okay? I think the crisis is, while we are concerned about, this was, I believe, Ben's point this morning, are you working at climate change, or are you working, for or with? Are you engaged? Or is what you're doing in action? Oscar said to me, Dan, if you want to understand my Yupik culture, you need to come to our fish camp. I never got to do that. But he says, I can't tell you what it means to be Yupik, but I can show you. I want to bring you to our fish camp some summer. The problem is the way we're living, folks. The way we live, our life ways. And those are cultural issues. Deloria Jr., the nemesis of many scientists who've read his work, he didn't bandy any words with scientists. He had a lot of gripes about science and scientists. But he was always ready for a true engagement, and that's what I admired about Vine. And if you never read anything else from Vine, probably not his most popular book, which, again, this will give you some flavor of Vine Deloria Jr., the scholar. His most popular book is Custer Died for Your Sins. That kind of gives you, he had a little bit of an edge to him, Custer Died for Your Sins. But he followed that up with a couple other books. We Talk, You Listen, Trail of Broken Treaties, and the most important one intellectually, I think, was God is Red, where he took on to say, I would like to discuss indigenous American Indian philosophical, theological, religious traditions, social organizations, and compare those to Western models and thinking about those institutions. And the chapter that has shaped my whole scholarship was a short chapter in that book called Thinking in Time and Space. And every person in here, I think, will be intrigued by that chapter, because what he says the primary difference between native thinking about history and colonial thinking about history is the colonizers who came here thought of their history as this unfolding timeline of progress. It was overwhelmingly temporally shaped. He said native people thought of history as primarily spatially shaped. We got a few geographers in here. We got a few spatial scientists and ecologists in here who know what he means by that. It's not just important when something happened, you got to understand where it happened and why it happened. I write about the nature-culture nexus. That's directly, I changed the words around. That's Vine Deloria's life's work in many respects. The key to understanding Deloria was to say, you can't understand native people unless you situate them in the places they call home, on the landscapes and seascapes where they live. Now, The problem we have is we live in a society that's predominantly shaped by a popular idea that culture is something we choose. Probably because we're so geographically mobile. Probably because of the media, the technologies we have. I think I'm going to have to go to Borders Borders doesn't exist anymore. They went out of business. Barnes and Nobles. What am I thinking? I guess one of the big chains. There are a few independent bookstores left. I hope there are in Lawrence, Kansas. But you go to a big bookstore, and what are two of the largest sections you find? Self-help and psychology and religion. And people are in there, I want to study, Taoist thought. I'm going to study Hindu. No, I want to study this. What religion am I going to be? Well, Henry's whole point was, hey, you're born Cheyenne. And we have a religion. We have a religion because our religion is tied to the land the Creator gave us and the relationships, the ceremonies, the customs and habits that connect us in that sacred covenant between people and place. We have no covenant like that anymore. We've broken it. People don't have homelands. They have suburban, gated bedroom communities. Some do. Okay? And I love the way they name them, flowering meadows, or, they always give these romantic names to these places that are built out in the prairie, but you're supposed to, because they know we want that. We want a kind of connection. I'd argue 3 principles I've outlined thus far, and I'm going to be explicit now. First, Native people will never argue about religion. The Seneca chief Red Jacket said it the best. We don't argue about religion, quite simply because it's rude. We expect you to have a different religion than us. But we get offended when you tell us we have the wrong one and you've got to be like us. That's cultural diversity. That's a cultural diversity that's related to a relationship to a particular place. An enactment of a covenant, a sacred relationship between people and place, people and land, people and water. I don't think there's anything romantic or unrealistic about that. We need the challenge to figure out how do we foster that sense today in the kind of world we live in. Native people can bring those kinds of issues to the table when we start talking about how we are going to be adaptive in the face of climate change. A spiritual dimension, first principle. I used to say I've never met an Indian who was an atheist, but I can't say that anymore. I had a student this semester who said, I'm an atheist, Dr. Wildcat. I said, okay, I won't say that anymore. Okay? But anyway, so a spiritual dimension. What's the second point? The second point is the point that Oscar said when he said about knowing and knowledges. And so I'll say this about the dialogue about indigenous knowledges. Let's have a hearty exploration of where those are complementary, how those might be complementary and useful in conjunction with the best kind of Western views and epistemologies about knowing and understanding and how we do that. But I think Oscar's point was quite simple, and that is that some knowing resides in doing. Any of you who are here who are fishermen, any of you here who are hunters, know if you have the choice between going out with the person who's read every book on hunting, he's an expert. He's read every book. He's got an annotated bibliography on, bighorn sheep hunting. Or a person who's grown up in the Intermountain West hunting bighorn sheep since they were old enough to carry a rifle. Who are you going to go out with? Everyone's laughing because you know. Because the knowing resides in doing. There are things you can't learn out of the book that you learn when you walk on the land about hunting. That's the kind of knowledge we've discounted heavily in the kind of modern institutions of education we have. And I think indigenous people can bring that back into the fold so we can have some serious discussions about what that means, particularly in the face of adaptation. So the second point is we need a serious examination of many kinds of knowledges and bringing those together. The third point would be, I think indigenous perspectives of climate change are, as the second point inevitably leads to, is it has to be bound up. Shannon said today, context is everything. Valerie talked about the same thing in her beautiful presentation this afternoon. Yeah, context is everything, and we need to situate the discussions we're having about adaptation in a nature-culture nexus, a recognition that we're bound up in that. There's no standing outside nature. You're sitting in nature right now. It's highly mediated by human intervention and manufacture. But this is the weird part. This is the dangerous misstep. No, we're not in nature. I want to go up to the national park so I can be close to nature. I want to get away from this. I want to go out in nature. No. We ought to sit here and think about what this space means to the balance of the planet around us. This is a very costly space. Maybe we ought to have different kinds of spaces. Deloria was great about that. Orin Lions, Onondaga Nation. How many of you heard the name Orin Lions? Okay. Orin Lyons said something at the 25th anniversary of Earth Day. My friend George Godfrey, Citizen Span Potawatomi, and I, USDA, said we'd like to have a native honoring of Earth Day on the 25th anniversary of Earth Day. And we said, okay, well, that's cool, and, give us a budget, and we'd like to invite some people to come. So, we had Croslyn Smith of the Cherokee. We had the late Thomas Benyakua of the Hopi, and Orin Lyons. And Orin Lyons got up and gave this great talk. And again, this will be the fourth principle, guiding perspectives on climate change. And this is a really critical one. He said, when people from USDA, EPA, Department of Interior, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they come to Onondaga, they always tell us, we want to help you manage your resources. And he says, we always have to correct them. And says, because we don't know resources. We live among relatives. We honor in our language the plants and the animals as relatives. You don't manage your relatives. You respect them. You don't treat your relatives like ATM machines, at least not in my family, or you're going to get put in your place real quick. The only time you show up is when you got your hand out. After a certain point, your aunt and uncle and grandma and grandpa are going to we don't really want to see you coming around a lot because you're not being very respectful. He said, no, we live among relatives. And he says it makes a big difference whether you think you live among relatives or resources. Because the real question once you start talking about resources is for whom? Oh, well, it's all about us. If you want to see a significant paradigm shift, do a mental experiment right now and tell me how your life would change if you left this room tonight and began living as if all of the life we share, the biotic life, the land, the air, the water, you treated them as relatives as opposed to resources. I think it'd be an interesting paradigm shift. Orin Lyons said that at the 25th anniversary of Earth Day, and I've thought about that a lot. Croslyn Smith, I've already mentioned. here's part of the story we've got to learn to tell with climate change, and I think Native people have some incredibly powerful stories that they can share to help us remember this. And they even have this embodied, in their languages. And so during 1992, during the quincentennial at Haskell, we invited elders from the 4 directions to come and say, how should these young American Indian Alaska Native students be thinking about this 500-year anniversary of the arrival of Cristobal Colon, or Christopher Columbus? Some people wanted to demonstrate. Some people said, oh, just ignore it altogether. Some people said, oh, no, it's a teachable moment. And so there was all this discussion. I guess they still have in Denver a big anti-Columbus parade or demonstration every Columbus Day, because I guess Denver still has a Columbus Day parade or something. And, a lot of our relatives, my cousins, they show up there, to hold signs of, castigating Columbus for his crimes and everything. And Croslyn Smith said something. He was asked to get up and speak for the elders, and he said something, translated it this way. He said, do you know why when we pray, we always honor the 4 directions? And he says, we do so because further than you can see around this blue-green planet, this Mother Earth, you have relatives. And when we pray, we never pray for ourselves. We pray for good relatives. And the Lakota have a phrase, which, pardon my Oklahoma twang, don't come beating me up afterwards, okay, for butchering your language. Most people dissuade me from speaking their foreign language because I can't lose this twang. It sort of always comes up, But they have this beautiful phrase, Matakiweoyase. And all that says is for all of my relations. When they pray, I'm praying for all of my relations, not just human relations, but plant, animal, fish, bird, relatives. Isn't there an ecology lesson there? Croslyn Smith told our students, remember that. We are all related. Dennis Martinez. Some of you probably have recognized this name. That picture doesn't come out very good. I guess it wasn't an HD picture. He talks about ecocultural restoration, and this sort of, really elides, I think, with that 4th point. It's very complementary. And you guys have been talking about social ecological, modeling. And this is exactly this kind of notion of we've got to situate everything we do in this nature-culture nexus, because that's where we live, in a nature-culture nexus. And Dennis was the first person to really start talking in international forums, indigenous forums, about, I don't think we should talk just about ecological restoration. We need to talk about ecocultural restoration, because we can't maintain the ecosystems unless our cultures are situated to enhance that system and support it. I don't think there's anything romantic about that. I think that aligns with a lot of what modelers here are trying to figure out. We need to have some good collaborations and discussions on that. Albert Whitehat, man, Rosebud Sioux, a teacher at Santa Ygleska University. Albert was real involved with a good friend of ours, James Ratlingleaf, when he started Native View, which was one of the first tribal college efforts to bring remote sensing and GIS technologies into tribal colleges. That's how I met James Ratlingleaf and was introduced to Albert by James Ratlingleaf. And I loved Albert because Albert said something. In fact, it was at the NOAA meeting, Planning for 7 Generations. And he told a story that moved everyone, and I think some of them weren't, some of them, while moved, I think they were probably in their mind going like, well, what's this have to do with climate change? Well, I'm going to tell you what he said, and the short version, and then I'm going to tell you what it has to do with climate change, I think, from an indigenous perspective. He said, you know, I was a very angry young man. And he said, my heart was full of hate. And I was mad at the white man. I was seething with this hate. And he said, so I went up on the hill. I went up on the hill to pray. And he says, I stayed up there for 2 days, no food, no water. Somewhere in that third day, he said, I started bawling like a baby. I couldn't stop crying. He's a big guy. And he says, when I got done crying, he says, I don't know how long it went on. He says, I could not quit sobbing. And he said, but when I got done, I knew if I kept that hate, it would kill me. And so then and there, I decided, I'm leaving the hate behind. I can't live with hate because it will kill me. I don't know if he's talking about a physical death, a spiritual death. They're related, okay, in many native ways of thinking. But what does that have to do with climate change? There's a thin line, I think, between hate would be one extreme reaction to something all humankind can recognize, and that is fear. And I would argue that what, in some ways, Albert was trying to communicate was, we have got to quit living in fear in the world. Fear of that person, of that thing, of that event. Because fear makes us do things that are very dangerous to ourselves and to life. That's why I don't think. I look forward to the days when we quit going to water security meetings. That's just a good question. So water security. So who's going to take our water? And now we've got food security meetings. And we even have something called Homeland Security. I think we have an ontology of fear in the modern world today. A real tangible sense that people live in fear. And I think one of the beauties of native traditions is while they had a hearty respect for danger, one of the hallmarks of wisdom was not to live in fear. Because of what that will cost you. We've got to be very careful talking about climate change, particularly with young people, that we don't, paralyze them with fear. This is, you guys all, some of you have experienced this. You can talk to young people and they go like, okay, we're doomed. I see what's happening. I mean, hey, I'm just going to party till it's all over. I mean, that's one way to respond, I think Albert's story was to say, there is an antidote to fear, and it's love. Now, it's not very popular to talk about love in scientific meetings. But I think we need the discussion. And love is about trust, it's about respect, it's about a lot of things. And those of you who've had meaningful relationships with other human beings know that's hard. We've got to start really thinking about the situation we're facing today in a different kind of story, one where there is some hope, that we're not perpetuating fear. Raylene, ha'alilia kawae ia. And I have to say that real slow. I won't get it right. One of the women who hosted us when Bull Bennett and some of us got invited, Bob Goff, to go to the Big Island to meet with Hawaiian natives. She's an elder from the Big Island. We lost her shortly. She started her travel in the big canoe across the waters about 6 months after we had the meeting. Profound influence. And I got ahead of myself because that's what she talked about, love. That was her whole thing, you know. When we're here, it's aloha, it's mahalo. It's you're here as ohana, you're here as family. A lot of indigenous people have these frameworks where you talk about the institutions you're within in terms of relationships, in terms of respect, in terms of responsibilities, and I think that's something we need to explore today as we think about climate change. Billy Frank Jr., I need to look at my watch. There's not a clock in here, and I do want to keep room for questions. And I'm going to use that up and nothing flat if I don't stop real quickly. So I'm going to skip a couple of slides because I want to honor an important elder in my life directly, very directly. But Billy Frank, again, you know, the chairman of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, said something that I want to say tonight. It's his words, and but I mean it. He used to come to meetings. He did this at Planning for 7 Generations, remember, Shannon? He goes like, I'm looking for volunteers. Does anyone in here want to volunteer? And a few people are kind of going like, you know, they thought, well, you know, for what? Volunteer. He said, wait a second here now. I'm not looking for a volunteer right now. I want to volunteer for life. We need volunteers for life, people who are ready to do the hard battles we're going to face so that we can create institutions and systems of life enhancement on the planet. Billy Frank, what a legendary leader. I'm going to skip through a couple here. They're all great people, as some of you in this room. Here's an influential elder for me, my eldest aunt, Josephine Bigler, one of our a half dozen really fluent elders in the Yuchi language. And in conjunction with my younger cousin Greg, her son, responsible for really creating the Head Start, Yuchi Head Start program, where we were teaching Yuchi to, 2 and 3 year olds as mother tongue language, and it worked. And is working. Incredible. Because everyone says, oh, the Yuchi language is dead. No, it's not. It is if you don't use it. But started really working with Richard Grounds and my cousin. And what I want to share as a way of closing is, I'll try to summarize these points I've made very generally, I guess, in maybe 3 more simple ways. And the third one is I'll attribute this kind of thinking to my Aunt Josephine. First one is, let's undertake to think about how we can start thinking about living in a world amongst relatives as opposed to resources. That'll be the first answer to the Anthropocene. It's not all about us. It's about the life system we are a part of, the larger life system. I don't know of any people who have stronger traditions of recognizing the unique gifts of individuals, personality, and rights, but I know that when you go to the most important meetings that are held among the Yuchi, the Zoyaha, our green corn ceremonies, when our elders get up and talk about why we do this, none of them talk about rights. They talk about inalienable responsibilities we have as human beings to the relatives we share this planet with. I don't think there's anything romantic about that idea. It's a different perspective. It's a different worldview. I think it's one we need to work with the best trained scientists in the world to see how we can use the tools you've developed in this framework. The third lesson is the one I'll attribute to my Aunt Josephine, the principal, and that would be this. That would be that, you know, when we think about wealth, we have a very distorted notion of wealth because of the kinds of institutions we're in. We think of wealth in almost purely material terms, you know, in terms of the things that we own and possess, our property. Are you a wealthy person? And what Aunt Josephine reminded me is that in the Yuchi traditions, what made you poor was you were a poor human being if you had no relatives. You're a poor human being if you have no relatives. Because resilience, which we like to talk about, those of us who work on climate, resides in the number of good relationships you have with the water, with the air, with the plants, with the animals, with the fish. Sounds like modern ecology to me. But that's ancient indigenous wisdom, I would argue. These are just some of the principles I've distilled. I went on longer than I wanted to, than I intended to. I'm going to stop now. I want to thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And if someone has a question, and I hope they do, I'd love to try to answer it or just tell you, shucks, I don't know. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions? Okay. Yeah. You know,
How do we actually find a reconciliation on this path to actually get back to principles of being
Because, you know, I think that's a great question. You know, the questions, you know, everyone in this room, by the way, Thomas Binyaki used to love to do this. So he picked one of you that would look most phenotypically European, and I saw him do this in meetings. He always walks up and he'd say, young lady, what tribe are you? And they don't think, well, I'm not Indian. He said, oh, I didn't say you're Indian. I said, what tribe are you? And they'd go like, well, I don't know. And he'd say, remember, young lady, you go back and you trace your ancestry. Your ancestors lived for a much longer period of time among tribal relatives than they did citizens of modern nation states. Everyone in this room has a tribal heritage. Some of us are just very far removed from that history. And I think your question speaks to this. How do we recover? I'll give the simplistic answer. I know it's more complicated than this. I'm not Jared Diamond, but I do think there's a little bit of what, you know, Jared Diamond talks about in Guns, Germs, and Steel. I would make the argument that we became infatuated with our discovery of tools and technology so infatuated that we thought we could change the world no matter where it was to fit us. And that was progress. And now we found out we can't do that. Now the question is, are we ready to make a paradigm shift and say, maybe that anthropocentric model is something we should leave behind, we can do that, and we should explore ancient, older traditions where people figured out how to live with the land, the water. I don't think that's romantic. I think that raises incredible questions of applications of technology. But you reframe technology. It's not about some anthropocentric notion of progress. It's about, is your technology enhancing community, culture, and communication? If we separate technology from those three things, I think we've got a very distorted valuation of technology. We should ask ourselves, is technology helping us be better community members in a social ecological way? Is technology allowing us better communication? Is technology strengthening our community? And that means not separating culture from nature, but looking at culture, this notion of biomimicry. I know some of you have heard this in this room, some of you systems thinkers, and I'm glad we have a bunch of you. But I think one of the most interesting things about systems thinking is this modern notion now, biomimicry. What we should do is try to model our institutions and systems after natural systems. And I'd say we got great examples of that with tribal people all over the planet who did just that, biomimicry. Yes.
So, wonderful comments, and I suspect many of the people in the room share the core values and many of the core principles, even though they arrived at them from different sources.
I'm presuming that. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing that, I'm not sure if it's a question or comment, it's something that I've observed and I find really troublesome. I don't know how to cope with it. Maybe you can help me with that. Is what if simply the majority of other people simply have other values?
Yeah.
In other words, what's striking about people is it doesn't matter what environment you go to, environments that we might think are unlivable, and ask people, how do you like living here? And there's always one answer. I love living here. The most dense city,
Right.
the place most divorced from nature, you get the same response. And my sense often is, oh, your values are wrong. This is not a healthy place to live. And I know it's not healthy for the planet.
Right.
But that's imposing my values on them. And so, on the one hand, we want to honor our relatives. And we want to protect resources and maintain resources and sustain the natural world. But I'm not sure that many of even a tiny minority of the planet share our views. Anyway,
Thank you for problem. No, so two quick responses, and then someone else, please weigh in on this, because one, I agree with you. Okay, that there's, and I'm not, I don't want to, this is something Vine used to constantly say. He says, I'm not here to convert anyone. I'm just sharing with you some knowledge I think might be useful. And so if you find it useful, take it. If it's not useful, just leave it. Because I'm not here to preach or convert you. But you asked me to share something, and I'm sharing. Now, are there people who just aren't going, who maybe they just like it fine. Maybe they're just in the bubble, not really thinking about the things we're thinking about. It's not at the top of their list. Out of sight, out of mind. Absolutely. That means we have to figure out ways to change the story we're going to tell so that we can demonstrate through some practical exercises that guess what? You might actually benefit if you leave some of your popular consumer wealth notions behind. See, they think you're taking something from them. You want to take something from me? No. I don't want to take something from you. I want to give you something. And can we tell that story? I think, okay, this is just me. I'm not speaking for, you guys realize this. I'm not speaking for anyone other than Dan Wildcat, okay? And I think we have to be very honest, and I think some other people in the room might agree, maybe there'd be a disagreement, but I would say the problem you're raising is primarily, to a large extent, tied to the fact that we act as if we no longer have storytelling cultures in this kind of society we live in, and that's a mistake. We have a storytelling culture. The problem is the stories that our children hear aren't told to them by their family, by their clan, by their tribal members around a fire or hearth anymore. They're sold to them by very large corporate entities that want them to buy things, and they're giving them values. For us not to accept this as the primary storytelling medium of the popular culture today is for us to be naive. I'm not even going to problematize this issue, but wrap your mind around this. Now, some of the people in geography will know there's a whole bunch of people in geography who do this. What do you do with millennials and Generation Zs? Now, that's Generation Z. What is it, 10 to or something to 13 or 15? Okay. These are the kids now who all have cell phones when they're 10 years old. And their environment is here. Oh, we keep talking about the environment as if it's out there. No, it's not. It's here. They spend more time engaged consciously with this device and devices like it than any notion of that. I don't know what that means, but I don't think it's good. I don't think it's good. That's a challenge. So we got to figure out how to use this to get young people to think about in here in relationship. That's a tough one. But I agree with you. I mean, that's the challenge. Now, why would I have hope? One more thing. Don't ever ask a professor a question because we can go on and on. I know I'm dissuading from anyone asking any more questions. But I got to make one more point. Okay. Don't ask Wildcat a question. We'll be here for a minute. Okay. One quick point. And I'm going to ask, and honestly, correct me if I'm wrong, Gary. Correct me if I'm wrong. Any of my native relatives in here. Correct me if I'm wrong, Valerie, David. Help me out here. But I'm going to put forward as a general principle the following point. And that would be this. That if we think about why we should have hope when we seem to be up against so many challenges, I would argue the indigenous answer to that is the following. It may not be up to you. See, this is that very Western. We're going to fix the world. Boy, that's a can-do, good pragmatic, that's a scientific inspiration. We'll fix it, we just need more data. More data, a better model, and we'll fix it. No, you might not fix it. So why should I keep trying to do the kinds of things I'm advocating you to do? Because it doesn't matter whether you fix it or not. All that matters to me when I leave this planet, I'll never leave it. Some part of me will be here. But when that spirit makes that journey, I want my relatives to say, Dan Wildcat was a good relative. Because he tried to live in a way that made it easier for us to share the things. We may not solve the problem. That's a bitter pill to swallow. But the question is, we will start your journey to the start with those relatives remembering you as a good relative and when you learn your responsibilities on this planet. I don't think it's romantic. I call that indigenous